whole purpose of today is to explain that the humanities, the philosophy, ideas, history, politics is central to who we are, but a career in those areas can be as exciting and rewarding as any career, any life. I think actually better. Right?
Absolutely.
And I've got a great example of that, Sarah Churchwell. You are like such an amazing person. I do this podcast and I invite you on all the time because Sarah is professor of literature, a history author, an amazing person, and you are someone who, when you're writing about the past, when you're writing about ideas, you're thinking about the present and the
Always.
future, right? And is that something that inspires you as a historian?
Absolutely. So, one of the ways I look at this is that, and in fact, as you said, I started in literature, but I've moved increasingly to history because I've seen how important it is to understand the world now. And the thing is that we can't study the future, and it's incredibly difficult to study the present because there's just so much around you. Where do you start? But the past actually is all we've got in terms of learning from human, that's all we have to learn from, right? You can only learn from what has gone before. So every time I try to make sense of what's happening now, one of the main ways that we have to do that is to try to find parallels, examples, context from the past where we can say, oh, I've seen something like this before. Now, it won't be identical to what's happening today, but to say, what are the parallels? What are the connections? Can I learn from that? But also, the other thing I would say is that a lot of the problems that we face today have their roots in the past. They didn't start yesterday. They didn't start a decade ago. Many of them started a century ago, 2 centuries ago, and we're living with the consequences of those. So we have to understand what the causes are that got us to some of the messes that we're in, and I think that's the only way we can try to solve those messes.
Okay, let's solve the mess that is Donald Trump.
Oh,
okay,
God.
we're going to solve it right now. In 2 minutes.
He's certainly a mess.
How did we end up with Donald Trump?
In 2 minutes?
Yeah, 2 minutes. Come on.
Oh my God.
What is the history that ended us up there?
Wow. Okay, not a challenge at all. So the history that got us there has to do with the way that the American Constitution was set up. So I'll tell you one thing that you might not know about how Donald Trump got into the White House, right? People talk about it today. They say things like 50% of the country voted for Donald Trump, right? 50% didn't vote, 50% did vote for him, right? That's what we hear all the time. It's not true. It's not remotely true. The real truth is that out of the 100% of adults who could have voted, voting age adults, 30% did not vote. They just didn't turn out. 30% were not eligible to vote because in America, if you're convicted of a felony, for example, you're not allowed to vote, or they didn't have the right documentation. So 30% were ineligible to vote. 20% voted for Hillary and 20% voted for Trump. Okay, that's actually the numbers. And he got in because of 77,000 votes in 3 states, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And that's been very, very well established. He got in by a kind of perfect storm of accidents, actually. And this tiny little group of people who voted for him pushed him over the edge. But the reason that he won was because of this thing called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was set up in the Constitution for complicated reasons that actually have their roots in slavery. And so because of the problems that were created in a democratic republic by having slaves, they created this system called the Electoral College. So the shortest answer to your question, in one sense, is that it was slavery that got Donald Trump into the White House.
Nice, that was pretty good. Let's have a round of applause. That's impressive. Well done, Sarah.
Which is to say, and obviously both of those things are bad, right? So a bad start created a bad outcome.
So I'm sure lots of people, lots of you guys think about doing history A-level, lots of you doing history GCSEs, and that's for me what's so exciting. Is people say to me, what are you interested in history for? It's finished. You go, history for me is not about the past, it's about today and It's about the future. I don't give a toss about Henry VIII's clothing particularly, but what I'm fascinated by is how on earth we're living in a world where we've got catastrophic climate change, we've got Donald Trump, we've got Brexit, we've got Boris Johnson, we've got Vladimir Putin. Those things are affecting us day to day, and they are all rooted in what has happened yesterday and the day before that. So let's talk a little bit, something that everyone's interested at the moment is fake news, Facebook, social media. So people are like, this is a whole new problem. We've never seen anything like this before. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, all digital. Surely history hasn't got anything to do with this. How do you look at that through the lens of history? And are there things that ring bells? Are there things that are familiar about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, what we're looking at is propaganda, and propaganda is an old idea. It's just a new form of propaganda with Facebook and digital media. It just has taken different shapes now. So, but propaganda, I mean, in fact, the word propaganda goes back to the Pope. So it actually goes back to the Middle Ages. So the idea that people haven't been lying to each other or trying to distort facts in order to persuade people to do what they want to gain power, that's as old as human nature, basically. People telling lies around the corner to try to get you to do, manipulate you, basically. But there are particular instances, absolutely, that really jump out from history. As an Americanist, for example, the one that would instantly leap to my mind is the fact that what was known as yellow journalism 100 years ago, which was like tabloid newspapers, right? So the idea of, and again, it was fake news. Yellow journalism was fake news. It was newspapers making up stories to sell newspapers. And in this case, it was the editors doing it. They would just make stuff up that they thought would make people buy their newspapers. And there was developed a rivalry between two major newspaper owners, like the kind of Rupert Murdoch of their day, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And they had this competition to sell newspapers. And in order to do that, they basically stoked a conflict over the ownership of Cuba between the United States and Spain. And they started saying, Spain wants to take Cuba. There's the Spanish conspiracy. You need to buy our paper and learn about the Spanish conspiracy to take Cuba. And they're going to invade America, and you need to buy the papers to learn about this. And so they bought all the papers. And basically, and this is not an exaggeration, their contest to sell newspapers and to make up the most outrageous stories that they could led to the Spanish-American War. And there was a war in which America gained not only Cuba, but Philippines, Guam, a couple of other territories. So literally the biggest possible consequences, a war and the change of nation-state relationships and territorial relationships. Oh, Puerto Rico was, of course, the other one, which, again, you're speaking of things that have major consequences today. Puerto Rico, you'll remember, was the victim of Hurricane Maria 2 years ago now. And part of the reason that was so devastating was because they don't have full statehood. And they don't have full statehood because of the consequences of the Spanish-American War. And that happened because of fake news. So again, we're talking about the most extreme possible consequences. People died there and they didn't get the support they needed because they're not an actual state of the union. And that goes back to newspapers trying to sell stories. So one of the things that I think about a lot when I look at history is this phrase, unintended consequences. And that means basically that, it's like what they call the butterfly effect, that, you and I can have a conversation and we have no way of foreseeing that might spark an idea in one of your minds and one of you might go on to become prime minister. And that would be, now it's an intended consequence because now we want that to happen.
We do.
But that you don't know what the rippling, unfolding consequences of any action that you take might be. And so these newspaper guys think they're just selling newspapers and it's no big deal. And it turns into an actual war. And as I say, and now 150 years later, we can say, well, there were knock-on consequences. A chain of events unfolded. And so to try to go back and reconnect those dots is like detective work as well, which is the other thing I really love about history. And that I think that we can bring as historians to fake news is what history teaches us is how to weigh evidence, like detectives. So we go and we look at evidence and we work out, does that footprint really show that that guy was there? Or does it show that that guy was there? Or can I be sure what that footprint shows? And so exactly like a detective trying to piece together a case, we go through history and we weigh the evidence and we say, is this legitimate evidence? What does this show? And then we can start to, again, kind of retrace those steps to understand, to solve the mystery of why we are where we are, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing about humanities. I suppose a whole building full of philosophers and historians and people in there and people like Sarah, is if you have that kind of outlook, that mental training, no one can take you for a mug, right? No one's going to take you for... Yep. If someone drives past the big bus saying we send £350 million a week to the EU, historians, people like you guys, people educated in the humanities, your first response is not, what the hell? Your first response is that true?
Is that true?
And that is again, so when we're talking about studying history, you're not I'm just got a fascination with William the Conqueror. You're going, I want to train my brain, I want to become a better citizen, I want to become a more skeptical person because I don't want to get taken advantage of. I don't want to allow politicians or fake news or PR to manipulate me.
Absolutely.
And so as a historian, right, so this is the difficult bit, you've identified this problem, you said we've seen it all before, so what do we do about fake news?
Well, one of the things that we do is we try to tell the truth. I mean, we try to debunk it. We try to say, look, let me show, and sometimes we can only do it one group at a time. We can only do it, one conversation at a time. But we try to persuade people. So part of it is the skills also of persuasion and argumentation, again, using evidence to say, look, I know you think this might be the case, but let me show you why. So it's like when you do math and you have to show your work. You say, here's how I arrived at this conclusion. Here's how I arrived at this answer. So I don't just say to you, this is the truth, take my word for it. I say, here's why I believe this. Here's what I can show. Here are the pieces that got me there. And so it's the other side of that skepticism that you're talking about. Skepticism isn't radical disbelief. It isn't, I don't believe anything. You can never convince me of anything. Skepticism means starting in a questioning mindset and saying, is this true? But then being willing to be persuaded that it is true by evidence. And not just because somebody shouts at you or says, well, you must believe this because you're part of my tribe or you're part of my team. It means judging for yourself and saying, I can see that this is how this happened. And that's why the humanities, sometimes people say, oh, the sciences are evidence-based, but the humanities, anything goes. It's whatever you think is true. And that's just a total misrepresentation of what happens in the humanities. The humanities is also evidence-based. It's just evidence that's taken from story and people and the human world, not the natural world. So we're not in competition with the sciences. We work together with the sciences. They try to understand the natural world. We try to understand the human world. That's why it's called the humanities. And obviously there's a lot of overlap there. It's not as if, we don't inhabit the natural world. And that's where you get things like the social sciences, which are, kind of where we come together. But all of us are looking at evidence and trying to understand the world better using that evidence.
Trying to understand the world better, that's right. Now, we got about 3 or 4 minutes for questions at the end. That was a short, sharp session. If there's no questions, I'm going to ask Sarah about Donald Trump again. If you've got a question, put your hand up. Do you think
But
you'll
I'm
be
not
Prime
allowed to
Minister?
swear in front of school students.
You're not allowed to swear, exactly. Your mates think you'd be Prime Minister. I saw everyone look at you when we were talking about being Prime Minister. I think we have a Boris Johnson in the audience.
Oh, no. That's a terrible thing to say.
Yeah. Like a future, whatever the word is. Okay, yes, question. Minister. Here we go.
Hello. You were saying about what we can do for the future. What can the young people do then, in particular? What could individuals do in terms? I know they have to have a curious mind and question things, but how do they go about doing that?
How do we all, whether you're young or old like me, how do we become better citizens?
It's a really good question. And I think that the shortest answer to that is by becoming more active citizens in the ways that we're talking about. What understanding your world isn't a passive relationship to your world. It's going out there actively and saying, I need to understand the world and my role in it so that I can be an agent for positive change, because I want to help make the world a better place, because I want to make the human experience a more positive one. And I have to understand things in order to do that. I have to understand my own political system. I have to understand what it means to be a citizen. I have to understand voting rules. I have to go out and vote, recognize that we don't have that many levers for change as individuals, but the vote is one of the absolutely most important ones that we have. And when we vote, we have to vote in an informed way. And that's, again, where the humanities comes in, to understand the issues fully enough that when we vote or make other kinds of interventions in society, that we are, as I say, doing so in an informed and a thoughtful way. I mean, another thing that we talk about sometimes with the humanities, and again, this is about where we work in complement with the sciences. Sciences and technology will ask questions like, can we do this? Or how can I do this? Can I make this thing? Can I make this thing do this? Right? But the humanities trains us to ask, should I do this? Why should I do this? What would happen if I did this? Right? And starting to think in that way becomes, as I say, a way to be a more active and informed citizen of your own society.
Yeah, that's a great question, because actually the more science pushes us on, the more we need the humanities. Like, I think about this, like when we land on Mars, what are we going to do there? Like,
what do we do?
Is it a good idea to have an American colony and a Chinese colony on Mars?
Exactly.
No.
Should we try to build a utopia?
Yeah.
That hasn't worked out very well in the past.
Should religion be allowed?
Exactly.
Right?
These are good questions.
And if we can
what kind of laws would we have?
Exactly.
And what kind of economy would we have? And what kind, will we allow gay marriage on Mars? Right? So a lot of those problems will get replicated, and the sciences only get us there. But they don't say, well, what do we do once we're there?
Yeah, and if you've got the ability to edit the genes of your unborn children, should that be allowed?
Exactly. Should you get to choose what kind of child you want? Should you get to choose if you want a boy or a girl? There are a lot of people arguing that that's exactly what gene theory would let us do, and then would you selectively choose? And these are big questions. They're difficult questions. I mean, personally, I don't think that's a difficult question. I think the answer should be no, you cannot choose not to have a girl, because of course that's the way it will play out. But it is not an easy question for a society to answer.
Don't leave it up to the scientists, guys.
God, I mean, really.
You've got to get the humanities people. Yes, another question. There you go, sir.
At the start, you dismissed Donald Trump winning of the election as unfortunate accident and whatnot. But what do you think of the rise of populism in the West? How big a role do you think the disenfranchisement of middle and lower classes is as a result of the establishment being more concerned with identity politics and cancel culture?
Yeah.
How big a role do you think that is?
Big question.
It's a big question. It's a terrific question. What I would say is that the answer to that question is, again, and so I didn't mean to sound dismissive, and I don't think it was an accident, but I think that there were a series of very specific things that enabled that to happen. I will say, personally, I think it was a terrible outcome, but that's just my personal opinion. In terms of that question about the left behind, right? It actually turns out that people living on the poverty line or below the poverty line in the United States overwhelmingly voted for Hillary Clinton. They did not vote for Donald Trump. The numbers don't hold out. So although that was the story the media told, you're absolutely right. It's not actually the story the election told when you go and you look at the statistics of who voted. It was overwhelmingly middle American in socioeconomic terms, in terms of their salary. People who earn between $50,000 and $99,000 a year, overwhelmingly white, voted to get Donald Trump in, and rich people voted to get Donald Trump in. So it's actually the story that's being told there is a story that actually benefits that establishment that wants people to think that it was about identity politics. It was not about identity politics. It was about money. It's always about money. And that is why people voted, because they knew that Donald Trump would make them, would it just is. I mean, you can show it. We can have a very quick follow-up question. He doesn't believe me.
I meant more so you brought up the question of race. I did mean middle-class white people, particularly. Same thing with Brexit. Same thing with the rise of far right in Europe.
Yeah.
I think it is these kind of people that have been disenfranchised in the modern day, and as a result have been pushed to more extreme.
Okay. I mean, I take your point. I think this is a conversation we could keep having for a long time, and because it's a really important and complex one. But what I would say again is that overwhelmingly those people, they feel disenfranchised, but the evidence doesn't show that they are in fact disenfranchised. And the fact that they keep voting for stuff like this and they get what they want would be evidence that they're not disenfranchised. They're the ones pulling the levers. And the people who are really disenfranchised, the people who are very poor, and in America in particular, African Americans, almost the entire African American community in the United States, are overwhelmingly more disenfranchised than those people. Those people are shouting about how disenfranchised they are and then getting what they want.
Guys, I don't think anybody is going to leave this tent doubting that politics, philosophy, literature, history is a fantastic way to spend your time, spend your studies, spend the rest of your life learning and thinking about. A tour de force from Sarah Churchwell. Thank you very much indeed.